Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1632. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, is rotting from within. Janissaries storm the palace, murdering officials before the eyes of their child sultan. The treasury is empty, the provinces in revolt. From this crucible of chaos, a boy becomes a monster to save an empire. This is the story of Murad IV, the iron-fisted tyrant who dragged his crumbling dynasty back from the abyss with blood, fear, and sheer terrifying force. Was he a savior or a butcher? You decide. The year is 1623. The Ottoman Empire, a behemoth straddling 3 continents, is bleeding from 1,000 internal wounds. In the heart of this storm, inside the cavernous halls of the Topkapi Palace, an 11-year-old boy is about to inherit a poisoned chalice. His name is Murad. He is not ascending to a throne of glory, but to a stage set for tragedy. The velvet cushions are still stained, metaphorically, with the blood of his uncle, Sultan Osman II, strangled just a year prior by the very soldiers who were meant to protect him. The Janissaries. Their roars of acclamation for the new child sultan are not cheers of loyalty. They are the growls of predators who have just tasted royal blood and found it to their liking. Imagine the scene. Young Murad, dressed in silks and jewels that feel more like a burial shroud than coronation robes, is led to the gilded throne. His eyes, wide with a terror no child should ever know, scan the faces of the powerful men bowing before him. He sees the grand viziers, the pashas, the ulama, but he knows, with a chilling certainty, that the true power resides with the swaggering bearded men in the courtyard, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. These are the men who deposed his other uncle, the mentally unstable Mustafa I, for a second time to place him here. They are not kingmakers, they are kingbreakers. Every whisper in the palace is a potential death sentence. Every shadow holds an assassin. For Murad, the throne is not a seat of power, but an executioner's block with a magnificent view of an empire tearing itself apart. He is a prisoner of his own destiny, a puppet whose strings are held by his ruthlessly ambitious mother, Kösem Sultan, and the military juntas that control the streets. This is the crucible that will forge the boy. It will either break him completely or temper him into something harder, colder, and more brutal than anything the empire has ever seen. While the boy Murad sat powerless in his palace, the city of Constantinople, the heart of the world, was rotting from within. The magnificent capital had become a den of wolves. The Janissaries and the Sipahis, once the elite shock troops of a conquering army, had devolved into a parasitic mob, a state within a state. They were no longer soldiers. They were gangsters wearing uniforms. They roamed the sprawling markets, not as protectors, but as predators, extorting protection money from terrified merchants. Coffee houses, hubs of intellectual and social life, were now breeding grounds for sedition and dissent, where plots were hatched in whispers over bitter coffee and thick plumes of tobacco smoke. The law was a joke, and the Sultan's decrees were worth less than the paper they were written on. The chaos was not confined to the capital. Across the vast expanse of the empire, the disease of anarchy was spreading. In Anatolia, local governors raised their own banners, ruling as independent kings and defying orders from the capital. In the east, the empire's great rival, the Safavid Shah Abbas, saw the weakness and struck, capturing the jewel of Mesopotamia, Baghdad, a city that had been in Ottoman hands for a century. The treasury, once overflowing with the plunder of continents, was now empty, drained by corruption and the ceaseless demands of the mutinous army. The empire was not just in decline, it was in a death spiral. This was the world Murad observed from his gilded cage. He saw the decay, he heard the riots, he felt the tremors of an empire on the verge of collapse. He was a sovereign with no sovereignty, a ruler with no rule. The city, and the world it commanded, was not his. It belonged to the wolves, and they were feasting on the carcass of a dying state. The lessons he learned were not of governance or diplomacy, but of a simple, brutal truth. Power, true power, did not come from a throne, but from the ability to instill fear. In the vacuum of power left by a child sultan, one figure rose to command the storm. Murad's mother, Kösem Sultan. She was not merely a guardian. For a decade, she was the Ottoman Empire. Officially named Naibi Sultanate, or regent of the Sultanate, she wielded power with a skill and ruthlessness that rivaled any sultan before her. Kösem was a master of the intricate, deadly dance of palace politics. She sat at the center of a web of intrigue, playing factions against each other with chilling precision. She would prop up one vizier only to orchestrate his downfall, bribe one Janissary aga to undermine another, and use the vast wealth she had accumulated to buy loyalty, however fleeting it might be. Her word was law, her network of spies was everywhere, and her authority was absolute. The divan, the imperial council, became a stage for her political theatre, where the fates of powerful men were decided not by merit, but by their utility to her agenda. And where was Murad in all of this? He was a ghost in his own palace, living perpetually in his mother's shadow. He was educated, trained in the arts of war and statecraft, but he was never allowed to rule. He was a symbol, a rubber stamp for his mother's decrees. He watched her meetings from behind latticed screens, a silent observer learning the brutal mechanics of power. He saw how she manipulated, how she bribed, how she disposed of her enemies without hesitation. He was both protected and imprisoned by her control. This regency was a double-edged sword. It saved his life and secured his throne during his vulnerable childhood, but it also emasculated him. It taught him that power was a game of survival, but it denied him the chance to play. A deep, simmering resentment began to build within the young sultan, a desire to shatter the shadow that eclipsed him and seize the power that was his by birthright. The year 1632 marked the end of Murad's childhood and the birth of his tyranny. The simmering discontent of the military finally boiled over. The Sipahis, the elite cavalry, fueled by arrears in pay and political grievances, stormed the Topkapi palace. They were not there to negotiate, they were there to demand blood. They swarmed into the second courtyard, their voices a thunderous roar that shook the ancient stones, calling for the heads of 17 of the Sultan's closest confidants and officials, chief among them the Grand Vizier, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, a man loyal to Murad. Now 20 years old, Murad was no longer a boy. He emerged to face the mob, his regal authority a fragile shield against their fury. He stood before them, pleading, reasoning, trying to protect his men. He offered them gold, promotions, anything to placate their rage. But the wolves had tasted power and would not be denied their kill. They screamed at their sultan, their insolence a slap across the face of the imperial institution. They rejected his pleas. In a moment of ultimate horror and powerlessness, Murad was forced to surrender his friend. Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, knowing his fate was sealed, bravely faced the crowd, only to be dragged away and literally torn to pieces before his sovereign's eyes. Murad was forced to watch. He saw his authority shredded, his pleas ignored, and his loyal servant butchered like an animal. This was more than a political crisis. It was a profound, personal violation. The humiliation burned away the last vestiges of the boy who had been ruled by his mother and feared his soldiers. In that bloody courtyard, something inside him broke, or perhaps something terrible was forged. He swore a silent, vengeful oath. Never again would he be weak. Never again would he be humiliated. He would purge the empire of this rot, and he would do it with a cruelty that would make the heavens themselves tremble. For nearly a decade, the Ottoman Empire was a ship without a captain, tossed on a sea of chaos. And on its throne sat a boy, Murad IV, a prisoner in his own palace. From the age of 11, he was sultan in name only. The true power resided with his mother, the formidable Kösem Sultan, and the cabal of corrupt pashas who orbited her. From behind the latticed screens of the Topkapi, the young Murad watched. He saw the heart of his empire bleed. He saw the Janissaries and Sipahis, the very soldiers meant to be his sword and shield, act as a ravenous mob, auctioning the state to the highest bidder. They murdered officials, stormed the palace gates, and openly mocked the authority of the throne. Each humiliation was a hot coal pressed against his soul. His older brother, Ottoman II, had tried to rein them in and had been deposed and brutally murdered for his efforts. This was the lesson seared into Murad's young mind. Weakness is a death sentence. While his mother navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, placating one faction while undermining another, Murad retreated into himself. He cultivated a deep, burning resentment, a private vow of vengeance against all who had weakened the House of Osman. He poured this rage into his body. He spent countless hours in the palace grounds, mastering the arts of war. He became a formidable horseman, a peerless archer, and a master swordsman. His physical strength grew to legendary proportions, his muscles hardening like the resolve in his heart. He was building an instrument of destruction, and that instrument was himself. He learned to mask his thoughts behind a placid, unreadable expression, a skill that would later serve him well. The courtiers saw a quiet, perhaps unremarkable boy. They did not see the furnace of ambition and fury being stoked within. They were nurturing a tiger, believing it to be a house cat, and they would soon pay dearly for their blindness. The year is 1632. The simmering anarchy of Istanbul finally boils over. The Sipahi cavalry, enraged by delayed payments and emboldened by years of unchecked power, storm the outer courts of the Topkapi Palace. They are a roaring tide of steel and fury, their voices echoing off the ancient walls. This is not a petition. It is an ultimatum. They demand the heads of 17 of the Sultan's closest officials, including his Grand Vizier, his Grand Mufti, and his childhood friend. They stand before the gate of felicity, the sacred threshold to the Sultan's private world, and they bay for blood. Inside, the court is paralyzed with fear. Kösem Sultan, the master manipulator, attempts to negotiate, to placate, to buy time. But the mob will not be reasoned with. Their arrogance is absolute. It is in this moment of supreme crisis that something within Murad snaps. The boy who had watched in silence for 9 years is gone. In his place stands a man forged in humiliation and rage. He orders the gates opened. To the horror of his mother and the court, the 20-year-old Sultan strides out to face the rebels. He stands before them, his expression an unnerving mask of calm. The rebel leaders present their list of names, their tone dripping with contempt for the boy Sultan. They expect him to capitulate, to sacrifice his loyal men as so many had done before. Murad listens. The silence stretches, thick with tension. Then he speaks. His voice is not the plea of a frightened youth, but the cold, hard command of a master. He agrees to their demands. But as he looks into the eyes of the rebel leaders, they see not fear, but a promise. It is a chilling, terrifying promise of a reckoning to come. He sacrifices his pawns, but in doing so, he has marked every single one of his enemies for death. On that day, in the blood-soaked courtyard of his own palace, Murad IV seized the reins of his empire. The regency was over. The reign of terror was about to begin. The blood of his loyalists was not yet dry in the palace courtyard before Murad began to move. His transformation was as swift as it was total. The quiet, observant boy was replaced by an avatar of imperial wrath. He had given the rebels what they wanted, but it was a poisoned gift. He had their names, he had seen their faces, and he would hunt them down, one by one. His first target was the new Grand Vizier, Recep Pasha, a man who had secretly orchestrated the rebellion, believing he could control the young Sultan. He was mistaken. Murad summoned him to the palace under a pretext. As the vizier entered, confident and smug, the palace executioners, the silent, deaf-mute Bostancers, stepped from the shadows. There was no trial, no appeal. only the swift, brutal justice of the silken bowstring. The message was instantaneous and terrifying. No one was safe. No rank, no position could shield you from the Sultan's vengeance. With the puppet master gone, Murad turned his attention to the puppets. He didn't just punish the ringleaders of the 1632 revolt. He annihilated them and their networks of support. He moved with a terrifying precision, using his own network of spies to identify every soldier, every officer, every clerk who had dared to challenge the throne. Night after night, squads of loyal soldiers descended on homes and barracks across Istanbul. Men who had toasted their victory just weeks before were dragged from their beds and executed without ceremony. The Bosphorus, it was said, was choked with the bodies of traitors. He did not stop with the military. He turned his unforgiving gaze upon the bureaucracy, the ulama, and the judiciary. He rooted out corruption with a surgeon's knife, executing judges who took bribes and governors who stole from the treasury. Fear, cold and absolute, became the primary tool of his governance. The chaos that had defined his youth was replaced by a rigid, deathly silence. The empire, which had been careening towards collapse, was suddenly shocked into order. It was the order of the executioner's block, an order bought with rivers of blood, but it was order nonetheless. Murad was no longer a boy hiding behind screens. He was the absolute terrifying center of the Ottoman world. Having broken the back of the military and political elite, Murad IV turned his iron gaze upon the very soul of his capital, its people. He understood that rebellion wasn't just born in the barracks, but whispered into existence in the smoky, crowded coffee houses and taverns of Istanbul. These were the places where men gathered, where news was exchanged, and where discontent could fester into sedition. And so, Murad declared war not just on treason, but on the social fabric that might breed it. In 1633, he issued a series of shocking decrees. He banned tobacco, coffee, and wine throughout the empire. The official reason was a concern for public morality and the risk of fires in the tightly packed wooden city. But the true reason was control. By closing these establishments, he was extinguishing the social hubs where public opinion was formed, where his rule could be questioned. He would not tolerate any sphere of life outside his absolute authority. But a decree was merely paper. Murad enforced his will with steel. He became a terrifying phantom in his own capital. Disguising himself as a commoner, a soldier, or a dervish, a practice known as tebdili kıyafet, he would stalk the streets and marketplaces of Istanbul by night, accompanied by his personal executioner. He would enter a hidden tavern, or find a group of soldiers illicitly smoking, engage them in conversation, and listen. If he heard a single word of complaint against his rule, or simply found them breaking his law, he would reveal himself. In that instant, hope would die. He would personally carry out the sentence on the spot, his sword a flash of moonlight in a dark alley. The stories spread like wildfire, seeding a deep and primal terror in the populace. A man lighting a pipe would look over his shoulder, wondering if the stranger beside him was the Sultan. The once bustling nightlife of the imperial capital evaporated. Istanbul became a city of silent, darkened streets, where citizens scurried home before nightfall, terrified of a chance encounter with their disguised, wrathful sovereign. With the Janissaries and the Sipahis brought to heel, Murad's gaze turned inward, to the very soul of his empire. He saw a society riddled with indiscipline, corruption, and vice, the same rot that had festered in his barracks and his court. His solution was not reform, it was purification by fire and steel. An iron curtain of fear descended upon Istanbul, the city's vibrant, chaotic heart. Its famous coffee houses and smoky taverns fell silent. These were not mere social hubs in Murad's eyes. They were dens of sedition, breeding grounds for dissent where men, fueled by coffee and wine, could plot and murmur against the throne. He banned them all, along with tobacco and opium, declaring them enemies of a righteous, orderly state. But a decree was merely paper. To enforce his will, Murad became a phantom, a terrifying spectre in his own capital. Shedding his imperial robes for the disguise of a commoner, he would stalk the streets and marketplaces by night, his elite executioners trailing him like shadows. Woe to the man caught smoking a pipe or sipping forbidden wine. The Sultan's justice was instant and absolute. There was no trial, no appeal. A sharp word, a silent gesture, and a head would roll in the cobblestone gutter. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated psychological warfare. He executed a Grand Mufti, the highest religious authority in the land, for a minor legal transgression. He had officials who displeased him torn apart. The message was broadcast in blood. No one, regardless of rank or station, was beyond his reach. The fear was palpable, a suffocating fog that seeped into every home. It silenced whispers, corrected postures, and enforced obedience. Murad, the boy who had watched rebels murder his friends and humiliate his family, was now ensuring that no one would ever dare challenge his authority again. He was forging a new empire, not on a foundation of loyalty or love, but on the unshakable bedrock of absolute terror. In the lethal chess game of Murad's court, some pieces still believed they were players, not pawns. The most arrogant of these was the Grand Vizier, Topal Recep Pasha. He was a relic of the old order, a kingmaker who had thrived in the chaos of Kösem Sultan's regency. He had helped place Murad on the throne and had been instrumental in the rebellion that saw the Sultan's beloved friend, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, butchered before his eyes. Recep Pasha carried himself with the swagger of an untouchable man, believing the young Sultan still needed his counsel and his connections. He had fundamentally misjudged the boy who had become a man forged in trauma and rage. Murad's revenge would be cold, precise, and deeply personal. The trap was set with chilling simplicity. In May of 1632, the Grand Vizier was summoned to the Topkapi Palace for a council meeting. It was a routine affair, and Recep Pasha arrived with his usual entourage, confident in his power. But as he entered the palace gates, he was separated from his guards. The halls were unnervingly quiet. The usual courtiers and petitioners were gone. He was led alone into the Sultan's presence. We can only imagine the scene. The young, physically imposing Sultan, his eyes burning with a cold fire, and the Grand Vizier, his arrogance finally melting into dawning horror. There was no lengthy accusation. The verdict had been decided long ago. Murad simply gave the signal. The palace executioners, the silent masters of the silk cord, emerged from the shadows. Recep Pasha, the man who had orchestrated rebellions and held the empire in his grasp, was strangled on the marble floor of the palace he sought to control. His body was unceremoniously tossed out of the gates. The shockwave was immediate and profound. If the Grand Vizier himself could be eliminated so swiftly, so contemptuously, then truly no one was safe. The last vestiges of the old regency were purged in a single act of brutal finality. From that moment on, there was only one power in the Ottoman Empire, the will of Murad IV. Having purged his capital and consolidated his absolute authority through terror, Murad IV now turned his gaze outward. For too long, the empire had been on the defensive, its borders bleeding, its prestige tarnished. The great enemy in the east, Safavid Persia, had exploited Ottoman weakness, capturing Baghdad and threatening the empire's heartlands. Murad would not delegate this challenge. He would answer it himself. In 1635, he announced he would personally lead the imperial army, reviving the tradition of the warrior sultan, an image not seen for generations. This was a direct echo of his glorious ancestors, Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent. He was no longer content to be the executioner of Istanbul. He would be the conqueror of Asia. The objective was the formidable fortress of Revan, modern-day Yerevan, a strategic linchpin in the Caucasus. The campaign was a masterpiece of logistics and discipline. The army that marched from Istanbul was not the unruly mob of his youth. It was a honed weapon, sharpened by fear and loyalty to its commander. Murad shared his soldiers' hardships, sleeping in a tent and eating their rations, but he demanded absolute obedience. Any sign of insubordination was met with instant death. He led from the front, his immense physical presence and legendary strength an inspiration to his men. The siege of Revan was a brutal, 11-day affair. Ottoman cannons, among the best in the world, relentlessly pounded the city's formidable walls. Murad was a constant presence in the trenches, directing cannon fire, encouraging his engineers, and leading prayers. When the city finally fell, it was a monumental triumph. It was more than a strategic victory, it was a powerful statement. Murad IV had proven he was not merely a palace tyrant. He was a Ghazi, a holy warrior, a true padishah in the mold of the empire's founders. He had restored Ottoman military glory with his own hands, washing away the shame of previous decades in the dust and blood of the Persian frontier. A victory in the east had forged Murad into a legend, but it could not erase the deepest fear of every Ottoman sultan: the threat from within. The ghosts of the past haunted him. He had seen his own brother, Osman II, dragged from the throne and murdered. He knew that in the brutal calculus of Ottoman power, a living brother was a potential rival, a rallying point for every discontented faction in the empire. While he was away on campaign, his surviving brothers, Bayezid, Suleiman, and Ibrahim, remained in the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace. Bayezid, in particular, was said to be handsome, popular, and skilled, possessing all the qualities of a potential sultan. He was a shadow that loomed over Murad's shoulder, a constant, unspoken threat. Before embarking on his greatest military ambition, the recapture of Baghdad, Murad made a decision that would forever define the darkest aspect of his reign. He could not risk a rebellion in his absence. He could not allow a coup to usurp the glory he was winning for the empire. To secure his throne, he invoked the terrible law of fratricide. The order was given. In 1635, while the army celebrated the victory at Revan, executioners were dispatched to the palace in Istanbul. His brothers Bayezid and Suleiman were seized and strangled with the customary silk cord, their royal blood forbidden to be spilled. It was a cold, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless act of statecraft. Only his youngest brother, Ibrahim, who was considered mentally unstable and thus no political threat, was spared, largely due to the desperate, impassioned pleas of their mother, Kösem Sultan. She managed to save one son, but could not stop the inexorable logic of power. Murad had secured his rear flank, eliminating any possibility of a palace coup. He could now march on Baghdad with an undivided mind, but at a terrible cost. He had become the very thing the system was designed to create: a solitary, unchallengeable peak of power, surrounded by the graves of his own kin. For 17 years, the jewel of Mesopotamia, the ancient city of Baghdad, had been in the hands of the Safavid Persians. It was more than a strategic loss. It was a wound in the heart of the Sunni Caliphate, a stain on Ottoman honor. For Murad IV, this was an intolerable reality. In 1638, after years of consolidating his power and purging his state, he turned his gaze eastward. This would not be a campaign led by viziers and pashas. This was a campaign of the Sultan himself. He marched at the head of a colossal army, a force forged in the crucible of his own iron will. The journey itself was an epic, a testament to Murad's meticulous planning and relentless drive. But it was the siege of Baghdad that would define his legend as a warrior king. He was no distant commander, observing from a silk tent. Murad was in the trenches, covered in dust and gunpowder, sharing the dangers of his common soldiers. He personally directed the placement of cannons, his voice a roar over the din of battle. He participated in the manual labor of building siege works, his immense strength and inspiration to all. The Safavid defense was fierce, the city's walls seemingly impenetrable. For 40 days, the battle raged. Ottoman assaults were repulsed and casualties mounted. But Murad's resolve never wavered. He was a force of nature, a tempest of pure determination. When the final breach was made, he was among the first to charge through. The victory, however, was drenched in blood. In a fit of vengeful fury that echoed the Mongol sack centuries earlier, Murad ordered a massacre of the city's garrison and much of its population. It was a brutal, horrific act, yet in the cold calculus of 17th century power, it sent an unmistakable message. Baghdad was Ottoman once more. Murad had not just recaptured a city. He had restored the empire's shattered pride and cemented his name alongside the greatest conquerors of his dynasty. Beyond the battlefield, the legend of Murad IV was built not just on strategy and steel, but on sheer, almost mythical, physical power. Stories of his strength spread through the empire like wildfire, becoming a crucial element of his terrifying persona. He was not merely a sultan, he was a force of nature, a titan in human form. Court chroniclers and European ambassadors alike wrote with awe of his Herculean feats. They spoke of a ceremonial mace weighing over 60 kilograms that he could wield with one hand for hours, a weapon no other man in the palace could even lift properly. He was said to have wrestled his own champion wrestlers, the Pehlavans, and thrown them with ease. In one famous account, while demonstrating his archery skills, he shot an arrow with such force that it pierced through 4 thick shields. Another tale claims he threw a javelin that penetrated the iron gate of a fortress. Perhaps the most enduring legend was of his strength on the move. Annoyed by the slow pace of his entourage, he allegedly lifted his massive Grand Vizier, Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of considerable size, and carried him for a significant distance without breaking a sweat. These stories, whether entirely factual or embellished over time, served a vital political purpose. They created an aura of invincibility. How could one conspire against a man who could crush a skull with his bare hands? How could an army stand against a leader who seemed to possess the strength of 10 men? This was carefully cultivated propaganda. Murad's physicality was a metaphor for his rule, overwhelming, undeniable, and absolute. He was the physical embodiment of the revitalized state, powerful, dominant, and capable of crushing any obstacle through brute force. In an age of intrigue and rebellion, his legendary strength was as potent a weapon as any cannon in his arsenal. At the apex of his power, with the empire pacified and his enemies vanquished, Murad IV found himself utterly alone. The throne he had secured with so much blood became a gilded cage, and the absolute authority he wielded was a poison that corroded his soul. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. The brothers, viziers, and officials he had executed were ghosts that haunted his every waking moment. He saw betrayal in every shadow, conspiracy in every whisper. This profound paranoia drove him from the cloistered halls of the Topkapi Palace into the dark, winding streets of Istanbul. Disguised as a commoner, often accompanied only by a silent executioner, he would stalk the city at night. These were not benevolent inspections. He was a predator hunting for dissent. He would enter taverns and coffee houses, establishments he had banned, to listen for careless words against his rule. The punishment for breaking his prohibitions, or for recognizing him and showing fear, was often instant death. A man found with a pinch of tobacco could be summarily executed on the spot. A tavern keeper serving wine would meet the same fate. These nocturnal patrols reveal the deep sickness in his mind. It was the restlessness of a man who could not sleep, a ruler so terrified of his subjects that he had to police their thoughts and minor vices himself. He had silenced the Janissaries, humbled the pashas, and defeated the Persians, but he could not conquer the fear within. He was surrounded by sycophants and terrified servants, but he had no friends, no confidants. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of power and suspicion. The Sultan who held the lives of millions in his hands was a prisoner of his own tyranny, isolated by the very terror he used to rule. There is no greater irony in the life of Murad IV than his final, fatal hypocrisy. The Sultan, who had famously banned coffee, tobacco, and wine, executing thousands for daring to indulge, was himself a profound alcoholic. While his subjects trembled in fear of his sobriety laws, Murad would retreat to the private chambers of his palace and lose himself in drink. This was not the casual sip of a monarch. It was the desperate, all-consuming addiction of a tormented soul. Why? Perhaps the wine was an escape from the crushing loneliness of his station, a fleeting solace from the ghosts of his victims. Perhaps it was the only way to quiet the paranoia that gnawed at his mind. Or perhaps it was the ultimate expression of his absolute power. The law was for others, not for him. Whatever the cause, his dependency grew ferocious. His legendary strength began to fail him. His once sharp mind became clouded, and his infamous temper, now fueled by alcohol, became even more volatile and unpredictable. His physicians warned him, pleaded with him to stop, but the Sultan who commanded an empire could not command himself. In early 1640, the consequences became undeniable. The Hercules of the Ottomans, the conqueror of Baghdad, was dying. Not from an assassin's blade or a battlefield wound, but from within. Cirrhosis of the liver was the diagnosis, a slow, agonizing decay brought on by years of heavy drinking. At just 27 years old, the man who had single-handedly arrested the decline of a great empire with his iron fist lay helpless, his body ravaged by the very substance he had forbidden to his people. His final days were a grim spectacle of a power that could not defeat a personal demon. The savior tyrant, the colossus of his age, was fading, his reign and life drowning in a river of forbidden wine. As Murad's reign of terror reached its zenith, a shadow lingered in the heart of the Topkapi palace. It was the shadow of his last surviving brother, Ibrahim. While Murad's other brothers, Bayezid, Suleiman, and Qasim, had all fallen to the executioner's silken cord, victims of the Sultan's cold, calculating paranoia, Ibrahim lived. He was not spared out of mercy, but perhaps out of a chilling form of contempt. He was confined to the cafes, the gilded cage, a luxurious prison designed to house potential heirs and prevent civil war. For 2 decades, Ibrahim's world was one of opulent claustrophobia. He lived under the constant, suffocating certainty that every footstep in the hall, every unexpected knock, could be the royal executioners coming to end his life. This perpetual terror shattered his mind. He was plagued by debilitating headaches, fits of panic, and a profound detachment from reality. His mother, the powerful Kösem Sultan, fiercely protected him, knowing he was the final fragile vessel of the Ottoman dynasty. She understood that Murad's strength was finite, and the line of Osman must continue. Murad, for his part, saw Ibrahim not as a rival, but as a pathetic, broken creature. He would sometimes visit the cafes, a predator observing his caged prey, perhaps to reassure himself of his own absolute power, in contrast to his brother's pathetic state. The tragedy was not just Ibrahim's confinement, but his slow, systematic dismantling as a man. The prince who entered the cafes was sane, but the man who would one day be called upon to rule was a ghost, haunted by the spectres of his murdered brothers and the ever-present threat of his reigning one. The iron will that saved the empire had also, through its chilling proximity, destroyed the mind of its only successor. In the winter of 1640, the Titan began to fall. Murad IV, the conqueror of Baghdad, the man who could reportedly lift 2 men on his shoulders, was dying. Years of relentless campaigning, political stress, and prodigious drinking had finally caught up with him. Cirrhosis of the liver was dissolving him from within. As he lay in his chambers, racked with pain and fever, his mind turned not to God or to the empire's future, but to its final perceived weakness, his brother, Ibrahim. In his delirium, Murad was possessed by a terrifying vision. He saw the empire he had forged anew with blood and iron crumbling in the hands of the trembling, mentally unstable man in the cafes. He could not, would not, allow it. The dynasty of Osman, he reasoned, was better off ending with a glorious conqueror like himself than descending into farce and ruin under a madman. His decision was as swift and merciless as any he had made on the battlefield. He summoned his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. The command was simple, unequivocal, and horrifying. Execute Ibrahim. Let the dynasty end with me. The order sent a shockwave of terror through the palace's inner circle. To obey meant extinguishing the 300-year-old line of Osman, an act of dynastic suicide that was simply unthinkable. To disobey meant defying the direct command of the most terrifying sultan in living memory, a man who had executed officials for the slightest of errors. The Grand Vizier and Kösem Sultan were caught in an impossible dilemma. The dying sultan's eyes, still burning with furious intensity, demanded obedience. But the survival of the empire itself demanded treason. The fate of the Ottoman world hung on their next move, balanced on the razor's edge between a tyrant's last wish and the future of a throne. The air in the imperial bedchamber was thick with conspiracy and grief. Murad IV, his body failing but his will still absolute, awaited confirmation that his final dreadful order had been carried out. He demanded to see Ibrahim's body. Kösem Sultan and Kara Mustafa Pasha knew that defiance would mean their own deaths, but obedience meant the end of everything. They chose deception. A plan was hastily concocted. The palace executioners were dispatched, not to the cafes, but on a fool's errand. A message was brought back to the dying sultan. His command had been fulfilled. Ibrahim was dead. But Murad, even in his final moments, was not easily fooled. He demanded proof. In a desperate gamble, the courtiers may have presented a fabricated report, or even the body of a recently deceased servant, hoping his clouded vision and failing mind would accept the ruse. Whether he was truly deceived or simply too weak to fight any longer, we will never know for certain. On February 8, 1640, at the age of just 27, Sultan Murad IV drew his last breath. The storm that had raged for 17 years fell silent. A wave of terrified relief washed over the palace. The tyrant was dead. The executioners were recalled, and the officials rushed to the cafes. They found Ibrahim cowering inside, convinced they were his assassins. He barricaded the door, refusing to believe Murad was truly dead, certain it was another one of his brother's cruel tricks. It was only when his mother, Kösem, brought Murad's corpse to the door of the cafes that Ibrahim finally accepted the truth. The ghost that had haunted his life was gone. Trembling, shattered, and utterly unprepared, Ibrahim I was led from his cage to the throne. The era of iron had ended. The era of madness was about to begin. What is the legacy of a man like Murad IV? It is a question etched in blood and paradox. He inherited an empire on its knees, a state in the terminal stages of collapse. The treasury was empty, the provinces were in open revolt, and the Janissaries and Sipahis ran rampant in the capital, murdering viziers and threatening the throne itself. In 17 years, he changed everything. He didn't just stop the bleeding, he cauterized the wound with a white-hot iron. He crushed the rebellions, purged the military of its mutinous elements, and refilled the state coffers through ruthless efficiency. His reconquest of Baghdad from the Safavids in 1638 was a monumental triumph, a restoration of Ottoman prestige not seen in generations. He restored the authority of the Sultanate, making the state feared and respected once more. But this restoration was built on a foundation of corpses. His reign was a litany of executions, estimated to be in the tens of thousands. He executed grand viziers, religious leaders, poets, and commoners, often with his own hands and on the slightest pretext. He ruled not through law, but through absolute terror. His prohibitions on coffee, tobacco, and alcohol were enforced with immediate death sentences. He stabilized the ship of state, but he threw overboard anyone who dared question his command. In the end, his deepest fear was tragically realized. The brother he spared, but had psychologically broken, ascended the throne. Ibrahim's disastrous reign would undo much of Murad's work, plunging the empire back into the chaos of palace intrigue and corruption. Murad IV stands as one of history's great, terrifying what-ifs. He was the necessary monster, the brutal surgeon whose methods were savage but, for a time, undeniably effective. He saved the Ottoman Empire from imminent death, but left a legacy proving that a cure born of pure terror can be just as poisonous as the disease.